But there's something just much more insidious when someone is using the authority that they have to abuse someone else.
Yet another female teacher is now accused of sexually assaulting teen students on multiple occasions. This time, investigators say the 24-year-old from Iowa sent students explicit photos via social media, had relations with at least 3 of them.
When I first started out tonight, I was more scared than anything and was like, okay, I probably won't be able to do this, but then I had to put it in my head, and then once I got to her, I was like, whoa, I can do this.
This is Cassidy Krause, a former middle school reading teacher in Manning, Iowa. She allegedly sent explicit photos, molested and sexually abused 13 and 14-year-old students.
Brent, I do think that there is clearly an abuse of power, right? The person is using the authority that they have as a way of coercing the victim into engaging in whatever abusive behavior that they're trying to engage in.
Forensic psychologist Dr. John Delatorre tells Law&Crime Network Krause's inappropriate relationships likely started with normal student-teacher interactions.
It is a pretty big jump, and it's a jump that actually happens over time, right? It's not one single jump. It's one little tiny little hop from one step to the next. Now, remember, some individuals actually do get sexual gratification from engaging in this behavior. So part of the thought process is also coupled with a physical gratification that the person is receiving from engaging in this behavior. It's also psychological in that they're getting attention from the victim. So there's a lot of dynamics that are at play when it comes to convincing the person that what they are doing is the right thing. They always know that it's wrong. They've always known, and they always will know that the behavior is wrong. They just don't care anymore.
Krause faces 6 charges, including sex abuse, 2 counts of lascivious acts with a child, and 3 counts of dissemination of obscene material to minors. Investigators say Krause used Snapchat to send explicit photos to at least 3 children in the first 6 months of 2022. She's also accused of molesting 2 13-year-olds in May of that same year. Authorities allege the abuse continued into January 2023, when she performed sex acts with a 14-year-old. She resigned from her position as a teacher back in August, when an investigation into the sexual abuse began. At only 24 years old, Delatorre says Krause's age could play a factor in her relationship with the students.
I think, there's always this aspect of, can you communicate with someone and have the same sort of thought processes when it comes to the topics that you communicate about? So someone who's like 30 or 40 years older isn't really going to have a communication style that's relevant to the abuser. So they have to find a different way of getting that victim to engage in the behavior. So if you're younger, you can easily have comments and conversations that the child, the victim, is already having. So you can find it's more of an easier way to get a victim by being younger and being able to communicate with them. And that's really what the goal is. You have to communicate first, and then you can abuse the victim.
Since the start of the 2023 school year, Law&Crime Network has reported on multiple separate but related cases, all where women in a position of authority allegedly abused a child or children. In September, we reported on the arrest of 38-year-old Alyssa McCommon, a Tennessee teacher who's accused of raping a 13-year-old former student in her home. Investigators say she used video games and eventually social media apps to communicate with students. She was booked into the Tipton County Jail but later released on $25,000 bond. Weeks later, she's now back in jail, being held without bond, after prosecutors say she reached out to the victim after her first stint in jail. While she was out, investigators say she used an unknown number to speak with the boy, saying he'd regret going to the police. She now faces additional charges of harassment, stalking, and coercion. After her second arrest, prosecutors played a voice recording in court, now alleging McCommon is pregnant with the boy's child.
I tried to tell you when it comes up looking like you. We don't have to talk anymore. Just please, God, tell me you're not going to say anything. I'll never speak to you again. I'll raise this baby and I love this baby. And I'll do it by myself.
Law& Crime Network also reported on a case out of Ohio where 24-year-old social worker Peyton Shires is accused of sexually abusing a 13-year-old boy she was counseling. While on the phone with the boy's mother, Shire admitted to the assault as police listened on. When investigators searched the boy's phone, they found videos of him and Shires having sex. She was arrested early this month and now faces charges of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. In all three cases we've covered, the alleged perpetrator used social media to communicate with the teens. Delatorre says that was likely their downfall.
I think it's getting caught more. I don't think that the rate of it is any more. I think the rate of teachers abusing students is pretty constant. I think what we see now is that it's getting caught more because evidence, as you said, evidence is out there more often than it was in the 90s, 80s, 70s, and early on. So I think it has a little bit more to do with people having the vulnerability of having all of this information leak out as opposed to earlier times when that wasn't the case. In the 90s, 80s, and 70s, early on, all of these things were happening. These things have been happening since there was a teacher and there was a student, right? So from the beginning of time, abuses like this have been occurring. But the technology wasn't there to engage in these kinds of things. And so like in contemporary times, having an online relationship and having an offline relationship are almost the same thing. And so you can engage in these kinds of sex acts, sexual texts, videos, images being sent to one another. And in some ways, it can be just as gratifying, maybe in a different fashion, but it can be sort of the same sort of intimacy developing kind of thing that the abuser wants to happen.
That means this apparent pattern we've been reporting on in recent weeks of adult women allegedly preying on teen boys actually isn't new.
Yeah, the only reason why we're seeing these cases now is because of the technology that is available, where there's more communication about sexuality and sex. All of that stuff is happening now. But again, it was probably happening at the same rate or higher early on, and the technology just hadn't caught up. I mean, it really did take someone saying that this abuse was happening. And even at that time, people probably didn't believe that the abuse was happening because who could believe that a woman was engaging in these kinds of acts? Right now, that's a product of societal myths and other things like that. So, what I'm saying is that it has happened. It's been happening for a long period of time. It's only now that evidence is being rendered and developed and easily accessed because of technology.
Rather than a new pattern emerging, Delatorre says it's the perpetrators themselves that are drawing attention to the cases.
Well, I think it depends on the person that we're talking about, right? If we're talking about a man that's engaging in these kinds of behaviors, we often look at them as being very predatory, right? That any man that's going to sexually abuse a child, we're looking at them as kind of like this monstrous behavior, right? This demon of society. But that's not really quite the same.
He says women sex offenders often view their relationships with underage boys as consensual.
When we talk about a woman that's engaging in the same kind of behaviors, and that makes it very peculiar because often what we've seen is that women who engage in what is considered to be a teacher lover type sexual abuse, where they're the older one, but the child, right, the person being abused is kind of a younger teen, right? So 13, 14, 15. When we look at that kind of dynamic, often the distortion, right, the cognitive distortion that is being used by the woman is that they are engaging in some kind of ability to teach them, right? It is about sexual gratification, but they've also sort of confused this thing to believe that the child has been engaging in the behavior as a willing participant, that they've been able to give consent in some form or fashion. They convince themselves that what they're doing is not predatory, that the interactions that they've had that are clearly inappropriate, text messages, social media connections, right? Those kinds of things. It's often looked as being sort of a dynamic that anyone would have in a healthy relationship, right? That the person asked for it, so they're going to give it, right? And they receive one in return. So there's also this curious thing where we're not looking at them as women as being predatory, although clearly the behaviors that they're engaging in is very predatory.
On top of that, Delatorre says the abuser may believe she's in love with her student or vice versa.
When it comes to the victim believing that they are in love with the teacher, that is a product of the coercive tactics being used by the abuser. Now, the abuser's a little bit different because there are cases, some very famous cases, in which the two ended up being in long term relationships and had children together. So it is. There's a word that goes on in social media called grooming. Now, grooming is the breaking down of psychological obstacles, right? The breaking down of psychological barriers in order to get the victim to engage in whatever abusive behavior the perpetrator wants them to engage in some ways. You also have to groom yourself. If you are the abuser, you have to convince yourself using cognitive distortions and mistaken beliefs into believing that what you are doing is the right thing. And so over time, the person being stressed out over intimacy problems in adult healthy relationships, whatever the issue is, they convince themselves that this person is giving me the attention that I want to get, but I'm going to ignore the fact that they're still a teenager.
In each case we've covered, the female defendant accused of sexually abusing a child also has or had a husband. Delatorre says they may view the illegal relationship as an affair.
They don't view the victim as being a child. So they probably view this as a way of escaping the whatever turbulent relationship that they believe themselves to be in, or to escape whatever stress that they will convince themselves. And an abuser will always convince themselves. Now, they may use it as an excuse or justify rationalizations. All of those things are just the things that they tell themselves to make it okay in their mind. They're just excuses. They're probably not even real. But they will find a way to excuse their behavior to include that this is an actual healthy relationship as opposed to the adult relationship that I'm in that's unhealthy.
Delatorre also says it's not easy to pinpoint what led up to the abuse, saying female sex offenders are much different than males.
You cannot apply what we know about adult male sex offenders to adult women sex offenders. You can't do that. The reasoning and rationale behind each individual person's sexual orientation, spectrum of sexual identity, everything is very, very, very different when it comes to those two particular biological sexes. So you can't apply one to the next. And we're still such a far road away from truly understanding female sex offenders as we understand male sex offenders.
He says it's possible the female may have been abused at some point in the past, but that's not always the case.
Yeah, that's actually pretty common when it comes to women sex offenders. However, the science doesn't support that when it comes to the teacher-student type of abuse. It's often less sexual abuse and more often emotional and verbal abuse that the woman has suffered early on in life. So there are other factors that are related to other kinds of abuse in which previous sexual abuse experience is relevant, but the science hasn't really supported that. And that being said, the science when it comes to women's sexual offenders is very, very, very thin. And there's so much that we don't understand as to why these kinds of abusive acts occur. But what we have seen is that sexual abuse, that the woman being sexually abused as a child isn't necessarily present when it comes to this particular form of sexual abuse.
As for 24-year-old Cassidy Krause, she's now being held in the Carroll County Jail in Iowa without bond. If convicted on all of the charges, she could face more than 3 decades behind bars and more than $30,000 worth of fines. Reporting for Law&Crime Network, I'm Sierra Gillespie.